The sleeper carriage. He locked the door himself. The sleeping car attendant heard the bolt slide at 10:30, and he said so afterward, and 3 other passengers in the neighboring compartments confirmed they had heard the very same thing, that particular, definitive sound of a bolt being drawn across from the inside. When the porter unlocked compartment 14 at 7 the following morning, Gerald Whitmore was dead in his bunk, the bolt drawn back from the inside, the window latch undisturbed, and no earthly explanation for how anyone had entered or left. The attendant who found him had served him his nightcap the previous evening, had folded his travelling coat and laid it across the luggage rack, had wished him a very good night's sleep, and had been waiting 23 years to do exactly this. Hello and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm Jack, your host, coming to you from Ohio, and I am very glad you're here. Tonight's mystery is one of the best of its kind, a locked room puzzle aboard a night train, with a solution that depends not on a great dramatic revelation but on a very quiet man's very long memory. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Not about mysteries, about life. Have you ever been owed something by someone who never paid? Not money necessarily. Something larger than that. An accounting, perhaps. A reckoning. Something you thought would come in time, and then more time passed, and you began to wonder whether time had anything to do with it at all. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. Now, we are going aboard the night train. Pull your coat around you, because it is cold in the corridors at 2 in the morning, and the story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The 647 from Victoria. The 647 from Victoria to Edinburgh departed on time, which was not invariably the case in November, when the cold seemed to settle into the points and the signals and the general mechanical disposition of the railway with a cussedness that the operating company could never entirely account for. This particular Thursday evening, however, the train assembled itself correctly and on schedule, and the passengers who had been waiting on platform 9 in the dark and the cold were admitted to their carriages with the particular relief of people who have been waiting in the cold and the dark and have now been let in somewhere warm. The sleeping car passengers were fewer than on a summer train. Gerald Whitmore had booked compartment 14 3 weeks in advance and had requested, as he always did on this line, a particular brand of single malt, a particular pillow arrangement, and a wake-up call at 7 in the morning. He was a large, well-fed man of 62, with a face that had the settled self-satisfaction of someone who had made a great deal of money and had never found the making of it morally troubling. He carried a good deal of luggage for a man travelling alone, wore a signet ring on his right hand, and tipped, when he tipped at all, with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned that the appearance of generosity cost less than its substance. He was, as Rosie remarked to no one in particular and to Miss Marple specifically, one of Mr. Doyle's regulars. Rosie presided over the breakfast car with the cheerful, indefatigable authority of a woman who has been in the same job for 22 years and has seen everything that the travelling public is capable of, which is, in her estimation, rather a lot. She was a stout woman with a large, comfortable face that invited confidences without quite meaning to, and she had the habit, common among people who are on their feet all day, of talking without particularly attending to whether anyone was listening. Miss Marple, who had settled herself with a cup of tea and her knitting in the dining car while the train was still making its way through the southern suburbs, attended with great care to everything Rosie said, while giving every appearance of attending only to the knitting. "She's returning from Edinburgh," Miss Marple had explained when Rosie, mildly curious about a small elderly lady travelling alone with a large quantity of wool, had asked. She had been visiting a friend. She would be going back to St. Mary Mead from Euston if the trains cooperated, which they generally didn't, but one lived in hope. "And are you a regular on this service?" Rosie had asked, refilling the teacup. "I see a lot of faces, you know," Rosie continued, not waiting for an answer. She wiped down the adjacent table with a damp cloth, her movements quick and practiced. "Thousands of them, over the years. You get so you can read a person by how they order their tea. The businessmen, always in a rush, looking at their watches as if glaring at the dial will make the train go faster. The young couples on holiday, too busy looking at each other to notice what they're eating. And then there's the regulars. The ones who take this line week in, week out, year after year." She paused, leaning on the back of a chair. "It's a strange thing, a night train. People think it's just transport, but it's not. It's a little world all its own, sealed up tight in steel and glass, hurtling through the dark. You see people at their most unguarded. You see them when the masks slip. When they're tired, when they're alone in the middle of the night, listening to the wheels. You see things." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, adjusting the tension of the blue wool over her index finger. "It must be fascinating," she murmured. "Fascinating isn't the word I'd use, exactly," Rosie said, lowering her voice slightly, though the dining car was largely empty. "Sometimes it's just sad. The lonely ones, staring out at the black window. The angry ones, picking fights over the toast. But you learn to handle them. You have to. You're trapped with them until morning, after all." She straightened up, brushing a crumb from her apron. "Which is why a good memory is so important. Knowing who wants what, and when they want it, before they even have to ask. It smooths the edges. Keeps the peace." "No," Miss Marple had said. "And you?" "Oh, I've been on this run 12 years, said Rosie. "You get to know the regulars." "Mr. Whitmore," she nodded with her head in the direction of the sleeping car, "is one of Mr. Doyle's regulars. Mr. Doyle's our sleeping car attendant. He always kept such careful notes on the people who come back season after season. Said it was the only way to give proper service, remember what they liked, what they didn't. The whiskey, the pillows, the wake-up times. I always said to him, it's more than courtesy, all that record-keeping. But he just smiled and said a good attendant has a long memory." "He sounds very thorough," said Miss Marple. "Very," said Rosie. 23 years on the railway, Mr. Doyle. Never takes a holiday worth mentioning. Very dedicated." She moved on to the next table. Miss Marple did not move on. She knitted 2 more rows and turned the work, and thought about 23 years, and about what a long memory might be for. Later, she would recall this conversation as the moment the pattern had begun to be visible. Not the moment she had understood it, that would come later, and take longer, and require considerably more evidence than a railway attendant's dedication to good service, but the moment the first thread had presented itself, and she had, almost without deciding to, reached out and held onto it. The train moved north into the dark. In the corridor of the sleeping car, she passed Thomas Doyle at perhaps 9:45, as she was making her way back to her own compartment. He was a compact, quiet man of perhaps 55, with a pale, regular face and the particular quality of stillness that some people in service positions develop over time, not servility, exactly, but a practiced invisibility, the ability to be present without being noticed, to occupy a space without seeming to displace any of the air in it. He wished her good night with courteous efficiency and moved past her without particular attention, carrying a small tray on which sat a glass of amber whiskey and a folded cloth. Miss Marple went to her compartment and read for a while and listened to the train, which spoke in its own language, the rhythm of the wheels over the joins in the track, the slight lateral sway that was different on a straight stretch from a curve, the periodic exhalation of the brakes at a passing station. She fell asleep with the light off and the curtain open a crack, because she had always liked to see the darkness moving past. At 10:30, she heard the bolt on compartment 14 slide home. She heard it quite clearly, because the corridor was quiet and she was, at that moment, not quite asleep, and bolts drawn across in the small hours of the night have a sound that carries with a sort of authority. She thought nothing of it. It was exactly the sound a man should make, securing himself for the night. She went to sleep. In the dining car, Rosie washed down the last tables and thought, with comfortable incuriosity, nothing in particular. 3 passengers in adjacent compartments heard the bolt. They confirmed this, all 3, the following morning. Rufus Alderton, who had compartment 12 and who had been awake at 10:30 and for some considerable time after, he was not a good sleeper, he said, which was true, heard it as well. He had been standing in the corridor for some minutes before and after the hour, he admitted, having gone out for a glass of water. The water tap at the end of the corridor. Just the water. Nobody asked him about this at the time, because nobody knew, at the time, that the water would matter. Chapter 2. Compartment 14, locked from within. The 6:47 from Victoria arrived at York at 6:12 in the morning, which was for minutes early, a circumstance that the station master noted with mild approval and which the passengers in the sleeper car, most of whom were still asleep, entirely failed to appreciate. Thomas Doyle began his morning routine at 6:30, a wake-up call to each compartment, in order, with the particular quiet knock that was neither intrusive nor ignorable. He moved along the corridor with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done the same thing 1,000 times, noting which passengers were already stirring, which required a second knock, which were the deep sleepers who would need a verbal prompt through the door. Compartment 14 did not respond to the knock. Doyle had noted the wake-up request as 7 o'clock, he was certain of this, he said afterward, with an emphasis that was quiet but distinct. 7 o'clock, as Mr. Whitmore always preferred. He returned at 7, knocked again, received no answer, and after a third attempt exercised his master key, as was standard procedure when a passenger who had left a wake-up call did not respond to it. The compartment was in order. The curtains were drawn. Mr. Whitmore was in his bunk. He was not, as Doyle established within approximately 30 seconds, alive. Inspector Holt of the Railway Police was at the York Station within the hour, a compact, capable man in his early 50s, with the steady temperament and the methodical habits of a detective who had spent 30 years following evidence wherever it led, and who had learned that the evidence almost always led somewhere straightforward, provided one was patient enough to follow it all the way to the end. He surveyed the compartment with the competent thoroughness of long practice. The bolt on the inside of the door drawn back. The window latched from the inside. The lock itself opened by the master key, which showed no signs of anything inconsistent with a standard operational opening. The compartment in order, not disturbed, nothing broken or forced. Whitmore's personal effects, arranged as a man who values order arranges them, coat over the luggage rack, shoes placed together beneath the seat. The cause of death would, the police surgeon suggested provisionally, prove to be cardiac arrest, though he was careful to note this as provisional. Mr. Whitmore was 62, and overweight, and did not give the impression, even in death, of a man who had taken particularly good care of himself. Inspector Holt interviewed all passengers who had been in adjacent compartments or who had otherwise been in the corridor between 10 o'clock and 7 in the morning. He interviewed Thomas Doyle, who was helpful, composed, and precise about the sequence of his actions and the timing of his rounds. He interviewed Rosie, who was helpful, distressed, and made 4 cups of tea for people who didn't particularly want tea but found it easier to accept than to decline. He interviewed Miss Marple, who was helpful, elderly, and said she had heard the bolt slide at 10:30 and had thought nothing of it, and that she found the whole matter very distressing, though she said this without any particular appearance of distress. He then interviewed Rufus Alderton, and found the interview rather more productive. Chapter 3. A Lady in the Dining Car. Miss Marple took her breakfast in the dining car while the train sat in York Station, and found it an adequate breakfast and an extremely instructive conversation. Rosie, who had recovered something of her equilibrium after the morning's events, talked with the compulsive volubility of a woman who has been asked to stop talking and found the instruction difficult to honor. She talked about the train and about Mr. Whitmore's regular habits and about Mr. Doyle's exceptional memory for those habits, and she repeated, without appearing to notice that she was repeating it, the observation about Mr. Doyle's careful records and his long memory, which Miss Marple found, on second hearing, considerably more interesting than she had on the first. She watched Doyle through the dining car window as he moved along the platform outside, speaking to 2 constables. He moved with the same unhurried precision she had noticed the previous evening, unhurried and exact and entirely at ease with the presence of the police in a way that men who are genuinely uninvolved tend to be, but without the slight over-ease of a man who is performing uninvolvement. He was simply a very calm person. Miss Marple had known a number of very calm people in her time, and her experience of them had been mixed. She thought about Rose's observation. A long memory. 23 years on this railway. Notes kept on the regulars, who they were, what they liked, what they didn't. What did a man with a long memory keep notes on, over 23 years? What kind of attention did it take to maintain that level of record, the degree of knowledge about the people who moved through one's care? It was not, she thought, the attention of a conscientious servant. It had a different quality, a different orientation. Conscientious service looks outward, at the passenger, at the need, at how to meet it. The attention she was describing to herself looked inward, in some way she could not quite articulate yet, as though the record-keeping were not about giving service at all, but about something else entirely. About knowing. She did not pursue this thought further, because it had not yet enough to stand on. She ordered more toast and thought, instead, about the other thing she had noticed, which was Thomas Doyle's wake-up call. He had said, very distinctly, that the wake-up call for compartment 14 was 7 o'clock. Whitmore's standard request, he had said. He always preferred 7. She had seen, among the passenger documents that had been laid out for Inspector Holt's review, a passenger request card for compartment 14. She had looked at it briefly while Holt was occupied with something else, which was a habit of hers that she did not particularly defend and found consistently useful. The card had shown a wake-up request. The figure on the card had been written over a previous figure, clearly visible through the ink, corrected and replaced. The original figure had been 6. The corrected figure was 7. It was possible, of course, that Whitmore had changed his own request. Possible, and entirely unremarkable. Passengers often did. It was the handwriting that she had noted. The correction was in a different hand from the original. She filed this away and finished her toast, and went back to her compartment, and wondered who, among all the people on this train, had needed Gerald Whitmore to sleep until 7. Chapter 4. The Nephew's Inheritance. Rufus Alderton was 38, dark, and had the kind of face that is better looking when angry than when composed, which was unfortunate, as he was angry a great deal of the time and composed infrequently. He was Gerald Whitmore's nephew through his mother's side and had been, until 6 months ago, his business partner in the family company. He was no longer his business partner. Gerald had seen to that. The dispute, Inspector Holt learned this from Alderton himself, who told it with the bitterness of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity to tell it to someone official and has finally found one, had been about the management of the company. Alderton had wanted to expand into European markets. Gerald had been opposed. The argument had become, over the spring and summer, something considerably less professional and considerably more personal, and had ended with Gerald invoking a clause in the partnership agreement that allowed him, as senior partner, to dissolve the arrangement unilaterally. Alderton had been bought out at a figure he described, with controlled fury, as deeply inadequate. He stood to gain control of the company on Gerald's death, through the terms of a trust his grandfather had established. He had known this. He had not, he said, and said it rather too quickly, had anything to do with what had happened on the train. Mrs. Emmeline Farr, who had compartment 16 and who was 71 and partially deaf and possessed of extraordinarily acute eyesight, had seen, or believed she had seen, she made this distinction with careful precision, a person in the corridor outside compartment 14 at approximately 2 in the morning. She had been awake, as she often was, and had opened her compartment door for some air, and had seen a figure at the other end of the corridor. The figure had turned away before she could see a face, but the build, she said, and here she looked at Alderton directly, was consistent. Alderton's build was consistent with approximately a third of the adult male population of England, a point his solicitor would eventually make with some force. But Inspector Holt, who had a case that needed a suspect and a figure in a corridor and a motive of considerable financial clarity, found the combination encouraging. he also found that Alderton's compartment key was accounted for. It had not left his pocket, he said, and the lock mechanism showed no sign of duplication or interference, but this, Holt reasoned, proved nothing if Alderton had used another method of entry, or had been at the corridor for a different purpose than the one most obvious. He did not have, yet, a theory of how. But he had a who, and a why, and in his experience these were the harder parts. Inspector Holt was a man who believed implicitly in the narrative logic of crime. In his 30 years with the railway police, he had encountered crimes of passion, crimes of opportunity, and crimes of desperate, meticulous planning. But invariably, they all followed a recognizable human pattern. Motive was the engine, opportunity was the track. Once you had identified the engine, you merely had to trace the rails to see how it arrived at the destination. Rufus Alderton provided an exceptionally powerful engine. The financial dispute, the bitter dissolution of the partnership, the impending court case that threatened to ruin him, these were not abstract motives. They were visceral, urgent pressures. And the inheritance, the sudden, convenient acquisition of the very company he had been ousted from, provided the ultimate reward. It was a classic narrative of greed and revenge. The how remained frustratingly elusive, yes. The locked door was a mechanical puzzle that defied immediate explanation. But Holt had seen clever mechanics before. He had seen strings pulled through keyholes, blocks of ice used as delayed triggers, elaborate timing devices that seemed impossible until they were demonstrated. The mechanism was just a detail. It would be deduced, eventually, through careful examination of the lock, the hinges, the window latch, and perhaps a closer interrogation of Alderton regarding duplicate keys or accomplices. For now, the focus had to be on the man. On keeping Alderton off balance, analyzing his movements, scrutinizing his alibi, and waiting for the inevitable crack in his aggressive facade. The train itself, Holt reflected with grim satisfaction, was the perfect holding cell. Alderton could not run. He was trapped here, under observation, as the investigation slowly tightened around him. He was very nearly right. It was just that he was right about the wrong man. Chapter 5. A particular quality of service. Miss Marple asked Inspector Holt, on the afternoon of Thursday, while the train was stationary at York and the inquiry was in its industrious middle phase, whether she might have a look at the passenger service records. She explained this request with great diffidence, citing the interest of a nephew who worked in railway catering administration, which was not an explanation that would have satisfied anyone paying close attention, but Holt, who had considerably more pressing matters on his mind, gave permission with the distracted generosity of a man giving away something he doesn't immediately need. The passenger request cards were the more illuminating document. She examined them in the small office the station had made available, with a pair of spectacles and a patience that had been cultivated over several decades of looking at things that other people had not looked at carefully enough. Compartment 14's card, the correction she had already noted. 6 o'clock, altered to 7, in a hand that was not Whitmore's but was meticulous, precise, with the small uniformity of letter form that characterizes a person who has filled in the same kind of document, in the same fashion, many thousands of times. The tipping ledger was a different matter. It ran for 18 years, because Doyle was a man of consistent habits, and it recorded, in the same small, meticulous hand, the gratuities given by each regular passenger on each journey, in what form, and in what amount. Whitmore appeared in it going back to 1937. He appeared with great regularity, twice a year, sometimes 3 times, always the same crossing, usually compartment 14. The tip, across 18 years, was always exactly the same. Not approximately the same. Not varying by a few shillings depending on the quality of service or the length of the journey or the mood of either party. Exactly the same. 5 shillings. Always. Miss Marple had seen consistent things before, and she had learned that consistency of this particular kind, mathematical, unvarying, entirely independent of circumstance, was not the consistency of generosity. It was the consistency of transaction. Something owed, paid regularly, in an agreed amount, because both parties had agreed to the amount and found it sufficient and had no interest in renegotiating. But what would Whitmore owe Doyle? She turned back to the page of the ledger covering 1935, before the regular entries began. There were notes in the margin, she saw now, observations written in Doyle's careful hand, in the very small script of a man who writes in margins because he has a great deal to say and limited space in which to say it. She needed better spectacles than she had with her. She returned the ledger and made a mental note, which was as reliable as most mental notes and rather more reliable than most people's, and went to ask Holt about the tipping anomaly. He found it interesting, he said. He would look into it. He was, at the moment, rather occupied with Alderton. Miss Marple said of course, she quite understood, and went back to her compartment, and thought about what it means to pay exactly the same amount to a person, year after year, for 18 years. She thought it probably meant you were afraid of them. Chapter 6. The Tampered Signal. The train had been held at York for most of Thursday, at the railway police's request, and was permitted to continue north on Friday morning, carrying its passengers and its unresolved questions in the uncomfortable proximity that railway carriages enforce. The atmosphere aboard had shifted perceptibly. The initial shock of the discovery had curdled into a pervasive, restless anxiety. A night train is designed for transit, for sleeping through the dark and arriving at the dawn. It is not designed for prolonged confinement during daylight hours. The corridors felt narrower, the compartments more airless. The rhythmic clack of the wheels, usually a soporific, now seemed to beat a frantic, unresolved tempo against the floorboards. Outside the windows, the winter landscape of northern England unrolled in a continuous ribbon of grey and brown. Bare trees, frost-hardened fields, the occasional huddle of stone farm buildings looking bleak and enduring under a low, heavy sky. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, no distraction, only a stark reflection of the grim reality contained within the carriages. Miss Marple spent the morning in the dining car, which had become the unofficial gathering place for those passengers unable to endure the claustrophobia of their compartments. She observed them with her usual mild, penetrating gaze. Mrs. Farr, knitting with the rhythmic intensity of someone determined not to think about anything unpleasant. A group of businessmen, their voices lowered, discussing the delay with irritable self-importance while casting nervous glances toward the sleeper car. And Rufus Alderton, pacing the narrow aisle near the vestibule, his anger visibly warring with his apprehension, a man who realized that every hour spent on the train was an hour the police were using to build a case against him. It was, Miss Marple thought, a most instructive microcosm. The polite fictions of travel had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable facts of suspicion and proximity. They were all, in a sense, suspects now, held in suspension until the truth could be distilled from the confusion. Inspector Holt had made it clear that no one was to leave the train without his knowledge, and the passengers had accepted this with varying degrees of resentment and compliance, Alderton with unconcealed hostility, Mrs. Farr with entirely uncomplaining practicality, Miss Marple with the equanimity of a woman who has no particular schedule and finds delayed trains conducive to thought. It was near Grantham, on Friday afternoon, that the second incident occurred. The signalman at Grantham North reported an irregularity with the advance signal on the main line, a lamp found to have been deliberately interfered with, the mechanism adjusted so that it showed a clear line when the line was, in fact, occupied. The driver of the 647, alerted by an emergency signal from the box, had brought the train to a stop 200 yards short of a junction that was not, at that moment, clear. The near miss had lasted approximately 4 seconds and had resulted in no injuries and in a shaking of nerves that several passengers found difficult to conceal. Inspector Holt was furious. This was visible. He was also presented, rather quickly, with information that redirected his attention from his fury to his suspect. Rufus Alderton, it emerged, was a director of the Midland Signal Improvement Syndicate, a company involved in the installation and maintenance of railway signalling equipment on several lines including this one. He had been seen, this by 2 stationmasters independently, in the vicinity of the Grantham Signals office on Wednesday afternoon, the day before the train departed. He had called in, it appeared, regarding a routine maintenance consultation. Holt's case against Alderton, which had been primarily circumstantial, acquired a new and uncomfortable dimension. Miss Marple sat in the dining car and drank her tea and said very little, and thought about the signal box log, and about who else might have had reason to be near Grantham's signalling equipment on Wednesday afternoon, and about whether a man who had spent 23 years on a railway might know something about signals. She also thought about timing. Alderton had been in Grantham on Wednesday. The train had left London on Thursday. The signal had been found tampered with on Friday. If Alderton had tampered with the signal, he had done so before he knew whether his first plan had succeeded, which meant he had been running 2 plans simultaneously, which was possible, but struck her as requiring a species of advance organization that the Alderton she had observed did not obviously possess. Whereas a man who had spent 23 years on this particular railway would have had occasion to visit Grantham North signalling equipment entirely without anyone finding it remarkable. It was, after all, his line. She said nothing of this to anyone. There was still the matter of the ledger, and what it said about the years before 1937, and she needed to see those pages properly before she said anything at all. Chapter 7. What she remembered in St. Mary Mead. In St. Mary Mead, some years before the war, there had been a man named Purvis who worked as a gardener for 3 households on the village's Better Road. He was a thorough, methodical man, and he kept meticulous records of what he had planted, where, and for whom, and when it had been planted, and when it might be expected to flower or fruit. He kept these records in a series of small notebooks, which he updated each week with the same careful, unsentimental attention that one gives to things that genuinely require accuracy. 3 households. 3 households where Purvis worked. 3 deaths, within 18 months, in those same 3 households. All of them unexplained at the time, though explained eventually, when a 4th death in a 4th household was investigated more carefully than the previous 3, and when Purvis's notebooks were examined with the attention they deserved rather than the attention they had initially received, which was none whatsoever. The notebooks had looked like records of gardening. They were, in fact, records of something rather different. Miss Marple borrowed Doyle's tipping ledger from Inspector Holt's evidence collection on Friday evening, having indicated that she wished to look at some notes she had been too short-sighted to read properly the previous day, and she sat with it under a good lamp in the station waiting room with a magnifying glass that she had borrowed from a kindly station master, and she read the marginal notes in Doyle's small precise hand, going back to the very beginning of the ledger. For names. She found 4 names in the margins, across 18 years, in addition to Whitmore's. For passengers on this line or connecting lines, noted not for their service preferences but for something else, connections, she read, painstaking notes about connections. A shipping company's board. A coastal defense authority. A Naval Reserve roster. The passenger manifest of a vessel called the steamship Morden Bay, dated 1912. She turned to 1912 in the ledger, which predated the formal entries but contained marginalia from what appeared to be a pocket diary, transcribed into the ledger's end papers. Her magnifying glass was barely adequate, but adequate enough. The Morden Bay. She had heard of this, vaguely, in the way one hears of things that were talked about and then stopped being talked about, a wreck, early in the century, some dispute about the conduct of the officers. She read Doyle's tiny, controlled account of what had happened on the Morden Bay in March of 1912, in the waters off the Pembrokeshire coast, in bad weather and failing light, with the ship going down and the lifeboats not deployed in time, because the first officer, one G. Whitmore, as she read, had not given the order when the order needed to be given. 23 people had drowned. One of them was Doyle's younger brother. He had been 19. For names. For passengers in the ledger. All 4, she now saw, carried marginal annotations linking them to the Morden Bay, in one capacity or another. The company that had owned the ship, which had 2 of the names on its board. The inquiry panel that had exonerated Whitmore, on which a 3rd name Saturday. The 4th, a maritime solicitor who had, it appeared, managed the legal arrangements by which Whitmore's responsibility was quietly dissolved. All for dead. All for, in the past 15 years, noted in the ledger with a small cross beside their names, and a date. Natural causes, all 4. Cardiac arrests, mostly, in men who were old enough that cardiac arrest was not, on its face, remarkable. The methodology, Miss Marple realized with a profound chill, was terrifying in its simplicity and its patience. There were no elaborate alibis, no staged accidents, no violent confrontations. There was only the slow, meticulous accumulation of knowledge, followed by a single, undetectable intervention. A sleeping draught slipped into a nightcap, strong enough to ensure deep unconsciousness but leaving no immediate trace. And then, the quiet application of a master key in the dead of night. What happened next, the actual mechanism of death, she could only surmise, but she had read enough medical literature, borrowed from Dr. Haydock in St. Mary Mead, to know that for an elderly man with a weak heart, a sudden, severe shock, or a brief, forceful suffocation with a soft pillow, would leave signs virtually indistinguishable from a natural coronary event. Especially to a busy police surgeon making a preliminary examination on a train platform. It was murder reduced to its most efficient, most invisible components. And the patient required. That was the thing that truly staggered her. To wait, not just for the opportunity, but for the perfect opportunity. To track these men across years, studying their habits, learning their vulnerabilities, noting exactly when they traveled alone, exactly what they drank before bed, exactly how deeply they slept. To maintain the facade of the perfect servant, the invisible attendant, while harboring an intent so cold and absolute that it could sustain itself across a quarter of a century. It was a kind of madness, she supposed. But a madness so rigidly controlled, so perfectly organized, that it resembled the highest form of sanity. Thomas Doyle had not simply executed a revenge plot, he had constructed a parallel life, an entire existence dedicated to the slow, systematic erasure of the men who had let his brother drown. Miss Marple put the ledger down and looked at the waiting room wall, which had a railway timetable on it that she did not see. She thought about 23 years. About a man who had waited 23 years, working on the railway, keeping his records, tending his long memory. About the particular quality of patience required to do a thing like that, and about whether patience, in sufficient quantities, curdled into something else, or remained what it was, only with a different purpose to it. She thought about his brother, who had been 19. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, and about 5 shillings, paid exactly 18 times a year, for 18 years. Not generosity. Fear. Whitmore had recognized Doyle. Had known, perhaps the first time he boarded and found Doyle in the corridor, who Doyle was. Had tipped the same amount every journey because the amount was a signal, I know you know. I am paying you not to do anything about it. 5 shillings per journey, and the price of his own conscience. And Doyle had taken the money. For 18 years, he had taken it, and kept his records, and waited. Until whatever in him that had been waiting was done waiting, and whatever in Whitmore had believed himself paid off was wrong. She returned the ledger to the evidence box. She went to her compartment and sat for a long time, which was unusual for her, because she was not generally a woman who sat a day. Then she went to find Thomas Doyle. Chapter 8. The Master Key. She found him in the far end of the sleeping car corridor, at the junction where the carriage met the next car, in the particular stillness that empty train corridors have at night, when the passengers are settled and the train is moving and there is nothing to be done and nowhere particular to be. He was standing with one hand on the wall, looking out through the narrow window at the dark fields going past, and he did not appear surprised to find her there. He appeared, if anything, as though he had been expecting her eventually. She said, "Mr. Doyle, I have been reading your ledger." "The whole of it?" He turned from the window. In the corridor light, which was a thin, yellowish sort of light that made everyone look slightly unwell, he had the contained, unremarkable face of a man who has decided, at some point, exactly what he is going to do, and has been living with that decision for long enough that it no longer disturbs him. He said, quite calmly, "I see." She said, "I believe that compartment 14's wake-up call was altered from 6 to 7. In your handwriting. I believe that the master key logbook shows that the key was removed from the duty box at 11 o'clock and returned at 1 in the morning. And I believe that Gerald Whitmore did not die of a simple cardiac arrest, though I imagine the symptoms may have presented in a manner consistent with one." She did not say this as an accusation. She said it as a statement of what she knew, which is a different thing, an invitation rather than a challenge, leaving a door open rather than closing one. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "My brother was 19. He couldn't swim. The lifeboats were right there. They were there, and Whitmore stood on the bridge and the lifeboats didn't go, and my brother went into the water in March off the Pembrokeshire coast." He paused. He had a very particular way of telling it, very even, very flat, as though he had told it to himself so many times that all the feeling had been worn smooth. He came back up once. The men on the lifeboat that finally went, 20 minutes later, they said he came up once and went down again, and that was all. She said, "I'm very sorry about your brother." She said it simply, because it was true, and because he had told her something true. He looked at her. He appeared, for the first time in their brief acquaintance, genuinely uncertain of something. She said, "I know that you will tell Inspector Holt what you've told me. I think you knew, some part of you, that there would be a Miss Marple on the train eventually." He said, after a moment, "I didn't know there would be a Miss Marple. I thought there would be someone." He looked back at the window. The money was. He stopped. He shook his head. "I took it because I wanted him to know I knew. Every journey. I wanted him to sit in that compartment and know." He looked at her again, and in his face, beneath the 23 years of patience, there was something that had been tired for a very long time. "Was that wrong?" She said, "I am not the right person to answer that question. But I think you knew what you were going to do in the end, and it was not the money." He said nothing. He turned back to the window. She said, very quietly, "The next station is Darlington. I am going to find Inspector Holt and tell him that I believe there are several things in your evidence record that require re-examination. I think, when he comes to find you, you should be ready to tell him what you told me." She left him in the corridor, looking at the dark fields. He had not expected her to be sorry about the brother. That was the thing, afterward, that he could not quite account for, not the fact of being caught, not the end of the waiting, but that she had looked sorry about it and had meant it, and that this, somehow, had been different from anything he had expected. Chapter 9. The last entry. Inspector Holt met the train at Darlington, which required a degree of railway police coordination that he organized with impressively rapid efficiency and no small amount of controlled irritation. He was a thorough man and he did not like being wrong, but he was also an honest man, and honesty requires one to revise an assessment when the evidence requires revision, which it clearly did. Doyle was calm, in the Darlington waiting room, with 2 constables at the door and the night pressing against the windows and the sound of a northbound goods train passing through on the adjacent platform. he told Holt what he had told Miss Marple, and he told it with the same even, worn smooth quality, and he answered the questions that Holt asked with the patience of a man who has reached the end of a very long undertaking and finds the paperwork, at this stage, neither surprising nor burdensome. He described the methodology in quiet, precise detail, confirming Miss Marple's deductions. The sleeping draught, meticulously measured to induce a state of unconsciousness so profound it bordered on coma. The master key, utilized during the brief window when the corridor was predictably empty. The means of death, a subtle restriction of the airway, applied with steady pressure, leaving no bruises, no struggle, only the appearance of a sudden, fatal failure of the heart. Holt listened, his face impassive, masking a growing revulsion at the clinical detachment with which Doyle described the murder. It was the detachment of a man recounting a necessary, slightly distasteful chore, rather than the taking of a human life. The master key logbook entry was there. 11 o'clock to 1. His handwriting. He had been in compartment 14, he said, at approximately 11:15, for approximately 12 minutes. Whitmore had been asleep, or had appeared to be asleep. The sleeping draught he administered in the whiskey was reliable and fast. He had done what he had prepared for 18 years to do, and had left the compartment and returned the key and gone to his duty station and had, for the remainder of the night, the long practice of a man who has spent 3 decades being calm in confined spaces. He had not, he said, expected to feel what he had felt. He had expected to feel something completed. He had not expected to sit in the duty seat at the end of the corridor, with the dark going past the windows and the train moving north, and think about whether 23 years had been enough. He did not say whether they had been. The duty seat at the end of the corridor was a narrow, unyielding bench, designed for vigilance rather than comfort. It was the station from which he had observed a generation of travelers, a silent sentinel in the rattling dark. He had sat there while the country went to war and came back again, while the fashions changed from stiff collars to soft, while the steam engines gave way to something newer and less majestic. He had sat there and watched the men who had condemned his brother grow old, grow rich, and, one by one, step onto his train. He had always known the order in which he would take them. The solicitor first, the man who had drafted the lies. Then the board members, the men who had approved the lies. And finally, Whitmore, the man who had lived the lie. The execution of it had required a discipline that bordered on the ascetic. He had denied himself a family, a home of his own, any entanglement that might distract him from the long arithmetic of his revenge. He had become the uniform, the deferential nod, the invisible hands pouring the whiskey. He had made himself into a mechanism of retribution, as precise and unfeeling as the lock on compartment 14. But now, sitting in the Darlington station with the constables at the door, the mechanism had finally run down. The spring was uncoiled. He felt a profound, echoing emptiness, a silence where the hum of his purpose had vibrated for 23 years. He wondered if his brother, in those last, frantic moments in the freezing water, had understood what was happening. He wondered if Whitmore, in the moment before the darkness took him, had recognized the face bending over him. He hoped he had. It was the only thing that made the 23 years bearable. But he would never know for certain. Rufus Alderton was informed that he was no longer a suspect, and received this news with a complicated face, the relief of innocence confirmed, somewhat undermined by the fact of having been a suspect at all, and the discomfort of now finding himself in the position of inheritor through death rather than design. He would, his solicitor would eventually confirm, inherit the company through the trust, and the inheritance would be everything he had wanted, and he would spend a considerable time thereafter finding it less satisfying than he had anticipated. This is a common experience. The train continued north after Darlington, carrying its freight of resolution and complication and the particular quiet that follows the end of a long-held thing. Miss Marple had her breakfast in the dining car. It was a perfectly adequate breakfast, the kippers especially, and watched the north of England go past the window in its winter colours, which were severe and beautiful and entirely unconcerned with the events of the previous 12 hours. Rosie refilled her tea. She did not ask any questions. She had, by now, a general understanding that something had been concluded, and she had the instinct, in this as in most things, not to press. On the evidence table in the Darlington Railway Police Station, Doyle's leather-bound ledger sat among the other items with its last entry incomplete, the entry for this journey, for Whitmore's name, which Doyle had begun in the hours before York and had not finished. There was a date, and the cross that marked the others. And then nothing. The page was as clean as a thing that has been waited for and has finally arrived. The constable who carried it out sealed the evidence bag with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned not to read what he is handling. It was, after all, only a record book. A man's notes on the people he had cared for, in his way, for 23 years. Which it was. And which it wasn't. Well, he waited 23 years. He kept his records, and he waited, and he was very patient, and in the end patience ran out, as it does, and tipped over into something else. I've been sitting with that, tonight, since we left the station. Thank you for being here. Truly, I don't take it for granted that you give an hour of your evening to midnight pages. The thing you asked in your comments, at the start, about whether you've ever been owed something that was never paid. I'd love to know what you think now, having heard this. Not about Thomas Doyle, specifically, about the question. Leave it in the comments. There's no wrong answer. If this story found its way to you, subscribe so the next one does too. There's always another train, another corridor, another door with a bolt on the inside. I'll be here when you're ready. Good night from Ohio. Sleep well. And be good to the people who remember you.